Happy first Wednesday of the new year, and we are ready to break in a new class. Before we do, we are going to be looking at the Bible and the book, the Josiah Manifesto by Jonathan Cahn, and getting some thoughts there for going into these end times that will be coming. We are wrapping up the 7 churches of Asia, and I just had a last little bit to share from Brother Worski's book on the book of Revelation, but on what he said regarding things mentioned in Laodicea in Revelation 3. So regarding this last of the 7 churches, Brother Worski in his book mentions, as we've talked about, Jesus standing at the door knocking, which tells us he's on the outside and not in their midst where he belongs. He mentions that this is, again, written to church people who are saved and baptized, and at least at one time were faithful in his service. So there's kind of a drift from what they started with. And I appreciate this point. He says, it's easy for men to blame their fall on others. The truth is that the state of the church not being spit out may well depend on one man opening the door and letting Jesus into his life. In the song, Send Revival, one verse says, start the work with me. And that's another one we haven't sung in a while, but if y'all remember that hymn, I appreciate the sentiment there. And how while there could be something that's plaguing the church as a whole, revival usually can start with one person. And so the encouragement there. Many times there have been turnarounds because one person, man, woman, or child, was a spiritual voice of reason and got everyone else on track. He makes this observation, which is interesting. Regarding Jesus and his resurrection. 40 days after his resurrection, he ascended unto his Father and ours, took his rightful place at God's right hand. 40 is the number of victory over suffering. Look for it in other verses that use 40. You'll see suffering, and at the end, you will see victory, which I found interesting because I've always equated 40 to a time of gestation. Pregnancies are 40 weeks. I see it as kind of a birthing process. So kind of a similar thought, with the suffering and then the victory afterwards. And so I appreciate him making that observation, which brings us to the first thing I want to share in my screen share. So let's go here first. Remember the thought about 40. Before we get to, we'll get back right back to that. Here is for our look at the Josiah Manifesto and the Bible. For anyone who may have wondered or had any concerns as far as how much scripture we're going to be in or using, here is a list of the Bible references and the scriptures quoted in the Josiah Manifesto that we will be talking about. So as you can see, we've got a few. I think it's like over 70 verses that we will be referencing in our journey through this. So now let me switch over to this one. Y'all remember this from Sunday school the last couple of weeks, where on September 11th of 3 BC, Tishri 1, New Year, Rosh Hashanah, how the constellation Virgo was being illuminated with the sun, and the moon was at her feet. And that took place on that day on the calendar. We can wind everything back and see that. I bring that up because, and I'll tie this into the 40 here in a second, with the 40 being the gestation with the sorrow and then victory. So one of the things that came up in side discussion was asked, so when is the next Jubilee year? The next Jubilee year is 2064. So remember here we saw, okay, 9/11, Tishri 1, for the possible conception of Jesus in 3 BC. The Jubilee in 2064 will start on Tishri 1. When is Tishri 1 in 2064? September 11th. When was that conception again? 9/11 and Tishri 1. So our next Jubilee will have both calendars coinciding. Again, the 9/11 on our calendar and the Tishri 1 on the Hebrew calendar. In the year 2064, the start of the new Jubilee, which there's some thought too that technically on the Jubilee years, they actually started on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. They skipped that. But thought that was kind of interesting I did look in the only eclipses happening around that time. There will be a total eclipse of the sun that August leading up to it. And 2064 will be 40 years from now. So if there's going to be a victory 40 years from now, then the suffering starts now, just so for burial. 40 years before. So what does all this mean is going to happen on Tishri 1st, 9/11 of 2064? Could be absolutely nothing. I don't know. But as we talk about looking forward and seeing different things and timings of things, all those things kind of lining up might be something to consider. Of course, all of us are going to remember that if we're still here when the time comes, but yeah, there we go. So without further ado, the Bible and the Josiah Manifesto. Hey, wasn't that a Beatles song? We'll be celebrating a centennial. We'll be having all sorts. Yeah.
Well, I'll be like,
Yeah, somewhere out there. Yeah. All righty. Well, so this book, the Josiah Manifesto, that just came out in September, this is different from the other books we have looked at. And there's some of his books I haven't even brought into class sessions or anything like that. This one's a bit different. He has a few of his own personal stories that he shares. So we'll talk about some of that. And so what we see here, basically what we're going to do is there has been someone, we're going to look at a couple characters from the Old Testament and see parallels in modern times leading into the future. We're going to see that there has been someone in modern times with a parallel to Moses. In fact, just in the last 4 years. We're going to be looking at the book of Joel, a book of prophecy towards the end times, which had some applications earlier in the New Testament and may have had some relation to a Jonathan Cahn experience, and then definitely has end time stuff related to it. We're going to talk about King Josiah, of course, the book's named for him. And we'll look at his example and how he is really, from Jonathan Cahn's perspective, the key to model after for being ready for the end times. I'll admit, when I first finished this book, I was disappointed because I was hoping for it to be expectations. I was expecting and looking forward to more discussion on what specifically was going to be happening in the end times and dealing more with that. But we've got Revelation and other scriptures for that. Instead, his focus was more on being prepared for it, which I do appreciate, and that is necessary, and certainly from a biblical perspective on that preparation. So we are going to see King Jehu from the time of Israel. We've had a modern parallel to King Jehu in our last 8 years, and we'll take a look at that. Timeline wise, we're going to be looking at some things we have not considered before. We'll be time traveling back to 1959. We'll spend a little time bringing out some new details from 1970 to 73, spend some time in 99 that we have not spent yet, a little bit in 2008, 15 to 16, then we'll move forward 2020 to today and really bring things out to where we're going. And when we're done with the Josiah Manifesto, we'll pick up with Revelation 4 and just go straight through the rest of the book of Revelation. So that will be the game plan there. Sound good to everyone? All righty, let's kick things off in the book of Exodus, chapter 2. And look at our first example, Moses. So I figured what we would do before diving into the events in the last 100 years or so, I figured let's refresh these Bible characters and events, these individuals, and kind of keep that refreshed and reawakened in our awareness, and then carry that with us as we go forward from there and see these things play out. So I know Moses is pretty well known and not a lot new to be said here, but there are some important things to understand and kind of consider when looking at them. In Exodus chapter 2, verse 1, a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. That's Amram and Jochebed, his aunt. Verse 2, the woman conceived, gave birth to a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got him a papyrus basket, covered it with tar and pitch, She put the child in it and set it in the pool by the bank of the Nile. His sister, that's Miriam, stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh, and in Sunday school we'll talk about who she is, came down to bathe at the Nile with her female attendants walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket in the middle of the pool, sent her slave woman, she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. Behold, the boy was crying. She had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a woman for you who is nursing from the Hebrew women so that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And so there we have this well-known account of Moses. And again, we're going to see a modern parallel to him in the last 4 years. But here's a thought from Jonathan Cahn on the Moses story here. It is of significance that the first of the nation's plagues, remember the 10 plagues on Egypt? The first of the nation's plagues begins in the same waters into which the Hebrew babies have been cast, the Nile. The first plague was the Nile turning to blood. In other words, the nation's judgment has returned to the place of the nation's sin, in this case, the nation Egypt. The nature of that first plague highlights the connection. The waters of the Nile turned to blood, just as the blood of the Hebrew children had once reddened its waters. And the man through whom the judgment comes had once floated down the same river, while other Hebrew babies were being killed in its waters. It is Moses as well who oversees the coming of the 10th and final plague, death of the firstborn, that of the judgment that slays the sons of Egypt. As Egypt had sought the death of Israel's sons, now it witnesses the death of its own. It is no accident that the plagues begin in the place where the male babies of Israel had been killed and culminates with the slaying of the nation's sons. And it is no accident that it is one of the Hebrew babies that Egypt had sought to kill and who had floated down the waters of death, who is now being the instrument by which the kingdom is broken. So I appreciate the connections and the dots and the parallels there. And again, we're going to see someone in the last 4 years who had somewhat of a similar story, believe it or not. Any reactions to those thoughts on Moses? All good? Yeah. So let's segue over to much further into the history of the Lord's people. Let's go to 2 Chronicles, chapter 21. Now, Josiah was a king of Judah. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split into the 2 nations. 10 tribes in the north were the nation of Israel. 2 tribes in the south were the nation of Judah. And those in the south included Jerusalem and the capital, and that's where the sons of David, descendants of David, line of David continued. Josiah is in that line. Well, his grandfather before him, 2 Chronicles 21, turn there myself, 2 Chronicles 21, verse, 2 Chronicles 21, 6. Boom, 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 boom. 194. Let me see something real quick here. This is why what you always do as a teacher is you always look over and check your references before you sit there in class and go, wait a minute, I think that's the wrong reference. Yeah, actually, 2 Chronicles 21 has a verse 6, but it's referring to, yeah, verse 6. Yeah, it's referring to a different king than I was thinking. So let's see here. Chapter 47, note 4. Okay. Well, I'm sorry about, I missed that, but the reference is to his grandson, excuse me, his grandfather, Manasseh, who is not a great guy. Manasseh, as the nation was turning away from God, these things became that were once kind of scandalous, then people became desensitized to them and they're allowed in more and more and more. First it happened in the north and they're going to get wiped out, and then it happens in the south. Well, down here in the south with Josiah's grandpa Manasseh, as these things are being legitimized and established and enshrined, see if this sounds familiar, the banner of openness and tolerance is withdrawn and replaced by an iron rod of coercion, oppression, persecution, cultural totalitarianism. Basically, love us, accept us, love us, accept us. And then once we're in, we're going to turn and not be loving and accepting towards others. And we're going to try to run the show, and it's our way or the highway and all that stuff. Jonathan Kahn mentions it's no accident Manasseh is recorded as having shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. So that is pretty bad. There we go. Yes, it was 33 verse 6. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 6. He also made his sons pass through the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced witchcraft, used divination, practiced sorcery, dealt with mediums and spiritists, did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Yeah, I would say so. So fix that right here. That is chapter 33. Cool. So, and Jonathan Kahn makes this observation with Josiah's grandpa here. It's the inevitable flip side of the coin. It's inevitable. The same culture that calls evil good would call what's good evil. If one embraces evil, one must end up waging war against the good. Of the great quantities of blood shed by Manasseh was the blood of the innocent, even the blood of the prophets and the righteous, as well as the child sacrifice, as we mentioned. So this guy, bad dude, he has an amazing story of repentance that I've talked about in the devotional series in the morning. So praise God for that. But then a lot of damage has still been done, and the results of that are still affecting the people. So that is Josiah's grandfather that we're talking about here. So when Jonathan Kahn mentions this point, and I did want to touch on this, where he says that if culture calls evil good, eventually it's going to have to call good evil. If one embraces evil, one must end up waging war against the good. And I thought about this, and I think this is what's happening in society. The envelope keeps getting pushed, keeps getting pushed. I'm on the side of tolerance. I'm on the side of live and let live, whatever you, okay, but then it keeps getting pushed. How far can you be in favor of these things before it reaches a line you can't cross? Or do you find yourself crossing over that line before you realize it because of the whole mission creep, because things have just been going and going, creeping and creeping further, and you're there before you realize it? One example is the topic of abortion in the present. Okay, I'm in favor, I'm not me speaking, but someone might be in favor. Okay, I'm in favor of early term, but not late term abortions. Okay, well, where do you draw that line? And as society keeps pushing for more and more and more, when do you reach a point where, okay, I was okay with this, but I'm not okay with that. I'm okay with social justice, but not rioting in the streets and vandalism and violence. Okay, well, it's amazing how quickly we get from one to the other. So be aware of how we are accommodating and what we're allowing before it gets to a point where before we realize it, we're way further than we ever intended to be. And the things we thought we were signing up for are a lot worse than we thought. And so things can only go for so long before it crosses over. So that kind of makes sense. Kind of see that playing out. Yeah. So now let's take a look at a interesting character in the Bible. True story of the man named Jehu, king of the 10 tribes of the north in Israel. For his account, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 10. 2 Kings chapter 10. So what happens is, I'll give you the lead up going into this. When the prophet Elijah was hiding from Queen Jezebel, Ahab's wife, the Lord told him, "You're not alone. I've got 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee." And then he talks about there being an anointing. There's going to be an anointing for Elisha, for Jehu, and for Hazael, who will be king of Syria. And he says, as far as the problem makers go, whoever Elisha doesn't handle will be handled by Jehu. Whoever doesn't handle will be handled by Hazael. It's kind of the point he's making. So we're told in advance this guy Jehu is going to be anointed. Well, it ends up being Elisha who is sent to anoint him. And he anoints him to be king of Israel. But we still have a living king of Israel right now, a son of Ahaz, who's now dead. His mom's still alive as the queen mother. So Jehu gets anointed. He goes and he, you know what? Let's back up into chapter 9 because it's just fun stuff. Yeah, 2 Kings chapter 9. So let's pick it up in verse 11. Yeah, no, verse 14. Here we go. So Jehu's on his mission now, anointed by Elisha. 2 Kings 9:14. So Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram, the king. Now Joram, with all Israel, was defending Ramoth Gilead against Hazael, king of Aram. The king Joram had returned to Jezreel to have himself healed of the wounds which the Arameans had inflicted on him when he fought Hazael, king of Aram. So Jehu said to the other men, "If this is your intent," the guys who were with him when he was anointed, "then let no one escape from the city to go tell about it in Jezreel." And Jehu rode in a chariot, went to Jezreel, since Joram was lying there recovering. And Ahaziah, king of Judah, had come down to see him. So you got the king of the north, Joram, you got the king of the south, Ahaziah. Both kings are together here, and Jehu's coming in town to take care of business. Verse 17. Now the watchman was standing on the tower in Jezreel. He saw the company of Jehu as he came, and he said, "I see a company." And Joram said, "Take a horseman and send him to meet them and have him ask, 'Is your intention peace?'" So a horseman went to meet him and said, "This is what the king says. 'Is your intention peace?'" But Jehu said, "How is peace any business of yours? Turn and follow me." And the watchman reported, "The messenger came to them, but he did not return." Then he sent a second horseman, and he came to them and said, "This is what the king says. 'Is your intention peace?' And Jehu answered, 'How is peace any business of yours? Turn and follow me.' And the watchman reported, he came up to them, but he did not return. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. 21. Then Joram said, "Get ready." And they made his chariot ready. Then Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went out to meet Jehu, found him on the property of Naboth the Jezreelite. When Joram saw Jehu, he said, "Is your intention peace, Jehu?" And he answered, "What peace? So long as your mother Jezebel's acts of prostitution and witchcraft are so many." So Joram turned back and fled, and said to Ahaziah, "There is treachery, Ahaziah." Then Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between his arms. And the arrow went through his heart, and he sank in his chariot. And Jehu said to Bidkar's officer, "Pick him up and throw him on the property of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember, when you and I were riding together after his father Ahab, that the Lord brought this pronouncement against them. I have certainly seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, declares the Lord. And I will repay you on this property, declares the Lord. Now then, pick him up and throw him on the property in accordance with the word of the Lord." So that's the son of Ahab there being killed by Jehu and being thrown on the property of Naboth, who had the vineyard that Jezebel had him killed for because Ahab wanted it. 27, when Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this, and this is the descendant of David here, he fled by way of the garden house. But when Jehu pursued him and said, "Shoot him too in the chariot," so they shot him in the ascent of Gur, which is at Iblim. But he fled to Megiddo and died there. Then his servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem, buried him in his grave with his fathers in the city of David. So, king of Israel and king of Judah both killed in the same instant here, both at the hands of Jehu here, who's now anointed. And so Jehu is taking care of business. Now, Jehu used to work for Ahab and Jezebel. He was one of their soldiers. He said, hey, remember when we were with them and the Lord said this about what they did to Naboth? Well, now the Lord's bringing it about. So Jehu is being used by the Lord to bring out the recompense for the wrong that's been done. And Jehu is going to continue to do some things in chapter 10. But before I go there, any reactions or questions on what just took place in chapter 9? I know it's like my 8th grade history teacher said, if you want sex and violence, read the Bible. So chapter 10, I'll skip over to verse 15. Now, when he had gone from there, I'm sorry, you know what? Let's back up. Let's back up to the end of chapter 9. I don't want to miss this. So we still have the queen mother, Jezebel. So 9. I'm sorry, 2 Kings. Yeah, 2 Kings 9:33. My apologies. 2 Kings 9:33. Let's back up to 30. When Jehu, so 2 Kings 9:30, when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard about it. She put makeup on her eyes, adorned her head, looked down through the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she said, is your intention peace, Zimri, his master's murderer? She's referring to a guy who is king, who got to be king by killing the prior king. And so she's accusing him of the same thing. Now, Jezebel had been the wife of Ahab, so she's had been the wife of the former king. Now she's the mother of the king that was just killed. And now she's casting this judgment on Jehu. So verse 32, Jehu, raised his face toward the window and said, who is with me? Who? And 2 or 3 officials looked down at him. Then he said, throw her down. So they threw her down. And some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and he trampled her underfoot. When he came in, he ate and drank and said, see now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. Her dad was a king in Phoenicia. So they went to bury her, but they found nothing of her except the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. Therefore they returned and informed him. And he said, this is what the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, on the property of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel will be like dung on the face of the field in the property of Jezreel, so they cannot say, this is Jezebel. Wow. So not enough left to bury of Jezebel. She has been thrown down. So again, this guy Jehu is quite something. Now we'll skip down into chapter 10.
Pretty rough.
Yeah, pretty rough. That's chapter 10, verse 15. So he'd gone from there, he encountered Jehonadab, son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he greeted him and said to him, is your heart right, just as my heart is with your heart? And Jehonadab answered, it is. Jehu said, if it is, give me your hand. He gave him his hand, pulled him up into the chariot. Now, Jehonadab is the son of Rechab. The family of Rechab, the Rechabites, were famous. God used them as example because their father commanded, okay, our family, we're going to be a little more strict. We're just going to focus on some things. So we're going to abstain from alcohol. We're going to do these other things. And the whole family followed his lead and obeyed. And God says, this family follows their father, yet my people don't follow me as their father. So he compliments these people. He says, you're always going to have someone alive amongst my people. So a great promise to these people. So this guy that Jehu grabs is one of those. So he says in verse 16, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. So he had him ride in his chariot. When he came to Samaria, he killed all who remained to Ahab in Samaria until he had eliminated them in accordance with the word of the Lord, which he'd spoke to Elijah. The whole household's being wiped out. Now, verse 18, Jehu's not done. Then Jehu gathered all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. Now summon to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshipers and all his priests. Let no one go missing, because I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu did it in deception, in order to eliminate the worshipers of Baal. And Jehu said, proclaim a holy assembly for Baal. And they proclaimed it. Then Jehu sent word throughout Israel, and all the worshipers of Baal came, so that there was not a person left who did not come. And when they entered the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. And he said to the one who was in charge of the wardrobe, bring out garments for all the worshipers of Baal. So he brought out the garments for them. Then Jehu entered the house of Baal with Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, and he said to the worshipers of Baal, search carefully and see to it that there is here with you none of the servants of the Lord, but only the worshipers of Baal. Then they entered to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now, Jehu had stationed for himself 80 men outside, and he had said, the one who allows any of the men whom I bring into your hands to escape shall give up his life in exchange. Verse 25. Then it came about, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, that Jehu said to the guard and to the royal officers, go in, kill them, let none come out. So they killed them with the edge of the sword, and the guard and the royal officers threw them out and went to the sanctuary of the house of Baal. They brought out the memorial stones of the house of Baal and burned them. They also tore down the memorial stones of Baal and tore down the house of Baal and made it a latrine, as it is to this day. Yeah. Verse 28. So Jehu eradicated Baal from Israel. And everyone lived happily ever after, who still lived. So Jehu was a rough guy who took care of business. Yeah. So we will see within the last 8 years, there has been a modern parallel to Jehu. Any reactions or questions on the biblical example of Jehu? Yeah.
To me, they're killing all these people. How is there any line still left living?
Yeah. The good news is he's killing bad guys.
Yeah, but
You know, the first, listen to all this, I mean, there's a lot. Killing it is the Bible here.
yeah,
I mean, like, I thought, like, when I look at the news today and hear all this stuff, like, that's still going on here, it's still going on now. For different reasons, you know.
Nothing new under the sun.
But it's to know from right from wrong.
Yes.
The way, and to learn from past.
Yes.
Why it's still happening today.
Exactly. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Absolutely. And that's the funny thing is people think they're being novel. They think they're doing something new. Okay, we're in a post-modern society. We're in a post-Christian society. Well, you're not going forward into anything new. You're just going back to what was before Christianity. And guess what? Life wasn't good then. And it's not going to be good, go well for you now. So yeah, exactly. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts on our man Jehu there? Yeah.
on the bad side, right? Yeah.
I was kind of thinking about back to even Noah days.
Yeah.
Noah had, when he went to the city, it was bad there. That's why he drowned everybody.
Exactly. And on smaller scales, because also he's not going to do that to the whole planet again.
Yeah.
He said, because if he did, he'd have to do it lots of times. He basically says after the flood, the intent of man's heart is evil from the time of his rising. So basically, if I were to do that every time it was needed, I'd be doing a lot. So I've made my point. I'm going to start fresh here. I promise not to do this again, not going to destroy the whole world with a flood. Next time will be with fire, but there's only going to be that one next time. So it's just the two, the flood and the fire. And we're in between the two. So that brings us to the book of, yeah, exactly. Broad, narrow. Yeah. So let's go to the prophet Joel, his book.
Which one?
Joel.
Joel?
So if you go to the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. Yeah. Yeah, it's a major stuff there. So after Daniel, we've got Hosea. Yeah, ladies going through that stuff. And right after Hosea is Joel.
And Joel?
Joel, let's go to chapter 2. And I have a funny personal story with the book of Joel too. So Joel chapter 2. We're now taking a look at Joel chapter 2, where verse 1 says, blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Indeed, it is near. Day of darkness and gloom, day of clouds and thick darkness. As dawn is spread over the mountains, so there's a great and mighty people. There's never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it to the years of many generations. I'm going to pause here. So blow a trumpet in Zion, referring to Jerusalem. Sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Okay, so big deal. Something's happening. Well, what's the backdrop and backstory to Joel? Well, it's one of the first books of the prophets that we have, if not the first. Obadiah somewhere in there. What happens is after that king of Judah gets killed, well, what happens is basically when the king of Israel gets killed, excuse me, the king of Judah gets killed, his mom, queen mother there, she kills her grandkids, who would have been the next king, and kills just about all of them, thinks she kills all of them, and she rules as queen by herself, Queen Athaliah. I refer to her as the murdering grandma. Well, the priest snuck away a baby and kept him from getting killed and raised him for 6 years. And then when he was 7 years old, then breaking news here, they caught the queen, took her out of the temple and killed her, and raised up this 7-year-old boy, Joash, to be king in her place and preserve the line of David. As we talk about lines being almost wiped out, yeah. And so this guy, this king, at 7 years old, grew up to be a very good king. He was king all the days that the priest who raised him was alive. And he grew up with the priest's son, Zechariah. They grew up as brothers together. What happened after that priest who raised him died? Well, Joash, now an adult, started taking advice from his peers and taking the bad advice, and he turned bad, even had the son of the priest who raised him, Zechariah, had him killed. And they'd grown up as brothers. Yeah. And so the Lord declares things are not going to go well for Jerusalem here with this. So he uses the army of Syria, also referred to as Aram, Syria, it's the same thing, to come in, and plague of locusts and all that stuff. This is where that comes from. So this is going to be invasion. God is going to be using this army to accomplish his will against his own people. Wow. So Joel is talking about this, announcing this. So blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm, let the inhabitants tremble. Okay, verse 3. A fire consumes before them, talking about the army that God's using here. And behind them flame devours. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but a desolate wilderness behind them, and nothing at all escapes them. Basically, it's gorgeous in front of them, but as they are devouring as they go, it's barren behind them. 4, their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like war horses, so they run. With a noise as of chariots, they leap about on the tops of the mountains, like the crackling of a flame of fire, consuming the stubble, like a mighty people drawn up for battle. Before them, the people are in anguish, all faces turn pale. They run like warriors, they climb the wall like soldiers, and each of them marches in line, nor do they lose their way. They do not crowd each other, every warrior of them marches in his path. When they burst through the defenses, they do not break ranks. They storm the city, they run on the wall, they climb into the houses, they enter through the windows like thief. Before them the earth quakes, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon become dark, the stars lose their brightness. Verse 11, the Lord utters his voice before his army. His camp is indeed very great, for mighty is he who carries out his word. The day of the Lord is indeed very great and awesome. Who can endure it? I'm going to pause right here and tell a funny story about me. So, in my days in the Navy, after my Catholic upbringing, and I go and I'm visiting other churches, charismatic Pentecostal churches and all that stuff, one of the songs that they would sing that I really enjoyed was based on Joel chapter 2. And I'm going to do a horrible version of singing some of it for you, just to give you an idea just from some of these verses. They rush on the city, they run on the wall. Great is the army that carries out his word. Like, yeah, it sounds cool. Blow the trumpet in Zion, Zion. Sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm. Yeah, cool, exciting. Yeah, army of the Lord's great. Then I actually read the book of Joel. These aren't good people. He's not talking about God's people here. I still like the song, but he's talking about bad guys, the army of Syria that God is using to punish his own people. Wow. It's amazing when you actually read and get.
It's the bad guy fighting.
Yeah. But notice in verse 11, the Lord utters his voice before his army. His army is the bad guys. Yes. His camp is indeed very great, for mighty is the one who carries out his word. The bad guys were mighty because they're carrying out God's word against God's own people. The book of Habakkuk is about this too, because Habakkuk's like, wait, God, you're using Babylon? Babylon? Do you know? And they kind of like how Jeremiah didn't want to go to Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. Same kind of thing here. But the thing about Joel here is there is deliverance promised. Yet even now, verse 12 declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, weeping, and mourning, tear your heart and not merely your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in mercy, relenting in catastrophe. Who knows? He might turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, resulting in a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. Blow a trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, proclaim a solemn assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and the nursing infants. Have the groom come out of his room, the bride out of her bridal chamber. Let the priests, the Lord's ministers, weep before the porch and the altar. Let them say, spare your people, Lord. Do not make your inheritance a disgrace, with the nations jeering at them. Why should those among the people say, where is their God? So here's this opportunity for a turnaround and to stop disaster. Verse 18, then the Lord will be zealous for his land and will have compassion for his people. The Lord will answer and say to his people, behold, I'm going to send you grain, new wine, and oil. You will be satisfied and full with them. I will never again make you a disgrace among the nations. But I will remove the northern army far from you, and I'll drive it into a dry and desolate land, its advance guard into the eastern sea, its rear guard into the western sea. Its stench will ascend, and its odor of decay will come up, because it has done great things. This army I'm about to use against you, you return to me, I'm going to send them back with their tail between their legs, basically. Verse 21, do not fear, land, shout for joy and rejoice, for the Lord has done great things. Do not fear, animals of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness have turned green, for the tree has produced its fruit. The fig tree and the vine have yielded in full. 23. So shout for joy, you sons of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God. For he has given you the early rain for your vindication, and he has brought down for you the rain, the early and latter rain, as before. The threshing floors will be full of grain. The vats will overflow with the new wine and oil. 25. Then I will compensate you, or make up to you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the creeping locust, the stripping locust, the gnawing locust, my great army, which I sent among you. Pause there. He talked earlier, the prophet did, about in verse 4, their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like war horses they run. It's an interesting observation. I do this at home. Pull up a picture of a horse's head, then pull up a picture of a locust's head. Their heads actually look similar. Kind of interesting. And there's some end time revelation stuff in connection with that too. And how the locusts are used like an army of horses and the march and all that. So swarming, creeping, stripping, gnawing. This army is the imagery he's using for the army of Syria. But he says in 26, you'll have plenty to eat, be satisfied. You'll praise the name of your Lord God, who has done wondrously with you. My people will never be put to shame. You'll know that I'm in the midst of Israel. I'm the Lord your God. There is no other. My people will never be put to shame. And it'll come about, verse 28, this was quoted in Acts on the day of Pentecost. It'll come about after this. I will pour out my spirit on all mankind. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your old men will have dreams, your young men will see visions. And even on the male and female servants, I will pour out my spirit in those days. So, wow, big stuff there in this little book of Joel. And this stuff will play out again, as we see. Jonathan Cahn has a personal experience at an event with this passage, and we'll go through that story and see what you think about that and his relating of that account. And this certainly does have some end time references as well, which we will get to. So, any reactions or questions on Joel, the backstory behind it, and all that was going on in there? And again, looking at Moses, looking at Jehu, looking at Joel, we see that, and then we're going to get to Josiah. We see that these four are going to lay the foundation and set the backdrop for the events we're going to be looking at in our modern times, heading us into the future for our journey into the book of Revelation. And how Josiah will set the example, his life will be the manifesto for us to role model into these end times. So next week, we'll take a look into the life of Josiah, grandson of evil King Manasseh. So with that, any other reactions, thoughts, comments, questions?
Right now it says, he says he'll move the enemy back. Can we say he has not done that yet because they're fighting now with
Hamas? Yeah, so that's a great question. So with Hamas attacking the Lord's people in Israel right now, is that a case showing that the Lord hasn't struck the enemy back yet? No, he hasn't. There will be a final outpouring of that. What we do know about the end times is that as we see in Romans chapter 1, where Paul describes how the people of earth turned from God, and so God gave them over to what they were seeking. Basically, and there's reference in scriptures too, to the time of the Gentiles, the time where basically the people of the world. In fact, Jesus says when he's arrested, he says, this hour, this present darkness is yours. Interesting. When Satan tempts Jesus and tries to, he says, I'm offering you the kingdoms of the world because it was Satan's to give. Adam had handed dominion over to Satan. And so he is the prince of the air, prince of this world. And so, yeah, he's got a time limit. And so what we do know it's going to happen is Satan is going to inspire the human being, the Antichrist, who will have his own false prophet. There'll be an unholy trinity. And they will usher in this whole time that's going to be in these tribulation end times that we talk about. Then when Jesus comes back, resurrection and rapture and his return, the Antichrist and beast, the false prophet, will be thrown in the lake of fire. And Satan will be bound for 1,000 years. So until that happens, yeah, they're going to think they're the head honchos, they're running in the game and they're in charge. But as I like to quote from Revelation 17:17, God's put it in their heart to carry out his heart. And so they think they're doing their own will. No, they're really falling right in line with what God has. Their whole one world government, all this stuff, they're just falling right in line with what God's going to take care of. So yeah, they are still kind of running rampant right now. And that's only going to continue. But for us, our job, as the example we'll see in Josiah, is to do what's in our power to do with the world around us. And that's what we are to impact and affect our own households, our own lives, and those in our community around us. And whatever the way of the world is, we do what's in front of us here, and God will take care of the rest. We do what we know God has us to do in the present. God will make known what he has for us next in the future. Just stay with God, do what's in front of us, and he will continually light the next step and the next for us and guide us through all of these. And we stay close to him, we'll be getting through all of this and come out on the other side through the suffering and pregnancy into the birth and the life.
Don't fear.
Don't fear.
Fight our battles.
Jesus said that about the end times. He said, do not fear, look up, for your redemption draws near. Absolutely. Yeah. Wormwood and all of that.
Read that, that's a cool thing to think about, when the stars fall.
Yeah.
I like the stars with the earth.
They're a lot bigger.
You gotta be for the stars.
And how's that going to work? Because Earth is a lot smaller than a star. So don't fall on us. Yes.
I mean, yeah, if it's God's will.
It's on me, but I
Yeah.
know, you see that sign and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm here, I'm ready.
Right. All right, so with that, that's a good stopping point. We'll pick up looking at the life of Josiah. And next week, so no other thoughts, comments, questions for this evening? All right, let's go ahead and wrap up our screen share and stop recording. And let's get ready to stand in the center and close out in our season of prayer.